Today I'm going to be doing a video on Final Fantasy XIII, a critical analysis that actually brings me full circle to where I started. I'd originally done a Final Fantasy XIII review, and I'd done a Final Fantasy XIII critical analysis on my old channel, and it was one of the few videos that I was unable to recover and actually repost up on this new YouTube channel. So in this case, as opposed to looking at the entire trilogy as a whole, because I actually do have some of those other Final Fantasy XIII videos, this is going to be a video focusing on Final Fantasy XIII itself, a full critical analysis of that, with the hindsight of the first one I had done already, and hopefully a vast majority of it will be an improvement over the original, but it also gives me an ideal chance to reflect upon those original views and see if I've had any changes after going through the entire trilogy and seeing how the games ended up, and if I did have any changes on those, because Final Fantasy XIII remains an extremely divisive game for various reasons, not necessarily because of the actual quality of the end product, but the direction that Final Fantasy XIII was pushed in by Square-Enix. It was a game that they pushed in a different direction, trying to lose its Japanese flavour that it had all those years, and what the game series had actually become more of an expectation of from the actual player base, and tried to make it something that incorporated more world values in an effort to actually make it more marketable worldwide in a way that actually backfired. So join me either again or for your first time going through Final Fantasy XIII in a way that hopefully is going to be very enlightening to those of you who have very little detail about how the game was produced and managed over those years of development, and ultimately a game that I still think is good, but overall out of the trilogy of games just got better and better, and is more of a game that made something of a misstep in its execution than it was an actual fully realised game with potential for sequels, as it was actually a retcon that pushes Final Fantasy XIII 2 onwards. And let's look at Final Fantasy XIII in some detail here, and you can come along for the journey. You see, Final Fantasy XIII as a trilogy relates in a way of evolution, that Final Fantasy XIII was very much sci-fi. Yes, it's a fantasy, all Final Fantasies are fantasy in a way, but the grounding of Final Fantasy XIII is very much sci-fi. It's all grounded in that very tech, and there's very little relating to gods and religion and Norse mythology and all things of what would actually go on throughout the entire 13 trilogy, as it would push more in those directions of general fantasy and less of sci-fi. But overall, the game has a theme of transformation, something that's very much apparent across the 13 universe of games. Final Fantasy XIII itself uses that in various ways. The idea of transformation is evident in how the characters change, how the Eidolons work, various aspects of gameplay as well. Everything is based around the theme of transformation, from the gameplay to the story to the execution of its actual mechanics and code. Of course, the gameplay, despite the fact that everyone has kind of made the joke the Final Fantasy XIII hallway now, but for all intents and purposes they're very much right, but the gameplay itself, the actual battle gameplay, is still some of the most rewarding if you can grab your head around how to execute the system perfectly. Yes, it's a game that can play itself, but if you think that's all you should leave it to do, then you're very much mistaken about how the game actually works and how to make the most of the system. And we'll talk about all this stuff in detail later when we get to the gameplay section, but the gameplay of Final Fantasy XIII is extremely rewarding, even if it is very much just linear outside of the actual battle gameplay. The characters themselves, the main characters, are very much diverse, even if it does mean some of them fall into standard JRPG character tropes, and others do actually manage to push outside those basic molds and to become characters that are actually rather unique for what they are, even if they lose their importance going through the main trilogy. The actual core cast in this game is fairly well rendered and explained, and mostly enjoyable, even if there are again some missteps in how those characters are perhaps handled, or more importantly written, as characters that mean that they more grain on the actual players when they're going through, even if their methods and actual thought processes are something that makes for an interesting character. The way they're portrayed and the way they're written makes them more of a bore on screen. Ultimately as well, we'll take a look at again of how 13 was part of the Fabula Nova Crystallis series, something that obviously originally was going to be Final Fantasy XIII, Final Fantasy Agito 13 and Final Fantasy Versus 13, and well, we all know how Versus 13 ended up and what happened to Agito, and how this ended up just being something that's more of the core Final Fantasy XIII trilogy. It's an interesting aspect of where they wanted to go with development, and when after the reception to all this they actually went and did it. Two paths that could have gone very differently and ultimately did if we got what they originally planned, and I do wonder what the fan reception of that would have been had we actually got to go down that path. Also, as this is a core review and analysis of Final Fantasy XIII itself, I'm not going to go too deep this time into the external media that goes into the backing of Final Fantasy XIII's story. Yes, there is a lot of supplemental media through novellas and extra flashbacks and bits and pieces that do go on throughout the game, that if you want to get a good rounding of what happens both post-game and pre-game and outside of that, then you can pick up these translated novellas and just read them if you want more background information. But I'm going to try and focus this time on what's actually in the game, with some just general references to them, so you know they're there and you can have some allusions to where the game is not providing you data when it really should. And there are a lot of places in the Final Fantasy XIII where the game story narrative itself does not provide you with the necessary data, and you're expected to go and look it up yourself, either through the data log that is a Mass Effect crazy biography of just about every aspect of the 13 universe, or, as I say, the external stuff that's separate from the main game itself. Now, Final Fantasy XIII, when it was actually released, was one of those games that actually received a lot of critical praise. Obviously, people have been anticipating it a long time, and it came out looking absolutely amazing and playing in a way that no other Final Fantasy did, and there was something of a bubble for a little bit before people started really diving in to see just how bad the game actually was, or at least how much of the game perhaps isn't nearly as good as what it seemed at first glance. And you can make comparisons with something like the Phantom Menace for that kind of thing too. Final Fantasy XIII doesn't opt to open with a setting as such. It drops you into the main plot, into a war straight away. When you're starting the game, you start in Cocoon in the town of Bodom when everything's being purged, and you're introduced to some of the main characters as well as a few sub-characters who set up the initial part of the game but don't all go on to be as important because you're very much on the run for the majority of the game. The hallway aspects of it is fairly accurate, to be honest, because you are constantly running down one path, and if you diverge, it's not for very long before you're on your way back, and that's at least for the vast majority of the game. What the game does actually tell you of its setup is done through flashbacks most of the way throughout the early portion of the game, where you're given the 13 days which slowly sum up what happens to each of the 6 main characters and what their actual motivations are, because at the start of the game it's very much unexplained to you, and that can be a real problem for characters that you don't know the backstory with but have graining attitudes to not either support why they're like that, and so it can mean that some characters you initially hate straight away and will continue to hate throughout the series, or you'll like them straight away, and when you actually find out more about them, that just helps endear them to you more. Unlike other Final Fantasy games as well, you spend a lot of time apart. Now, Final Fantasy XIII never actually does the section where you're put on your own as one singular person. You're always grouped in 2, and that's possibly because the battle system just wouldn't work if it was one character alone. It's very much a team-based battle system. One person has to stagger and one person has to do the ravaging at the very least to get someone up to their stagger bar in order to defeat them. We'll talk about all that later though. The story of Final Fantasy XIII is obscure and obtuse at best. If anything, the data log that's given and constantly updated through the game is almost mandatory reading to understand what's going on in the grand scope of things, as well as understanding plot points that are going to become far more major things later on in the game too. In the same vein as Mass Effect, for example, but not so much required reading in that case, and that's just more flavor text to help you learn more about the universe. Final Fantasy XIII requires you to learn about the universe to understand what's going on in the main plot for your main characters, which is a big faux pas when it comes to general story narrative in any format whatsoever. As such, for this I'll try and sum up some of the setting to make it a little bit easier, especially if you've not played Final Fantasy XIII before, which if you're watching this video seems unlikely, but there we go. The world of Final Fantasy XIII is set on the world of Grand Pulse, and that's just mostly called Pulse in the game, and rival to that is Cocoon, which is a massive artificial place where people live as well, and back in the past there was a big war between the two, and because of that the citizens are now constantly scared of the people of Grand Pulse, and the government obviously uses that fear to maintain control. On top of this, we also have the Foul Sea, which are godlike mechanical constructions that essentially provide everything that the humans use to survive, being it water, air, food, everything that they possibly need. And outside of their own tasks, they also have the ability to give a focus and make any human their servant, and this comes with a cost either way. They're given cryptic like visions of a task they have to complete, and they have to work out what that is themselves. If they fail, they turn into a monster, and if they succeed, they get turned into crystal and given everlasting life. It's very much a double-edged sword, and that's very much the undertone theme of the world itself as well, that anyone who gets this is very much cursed either way, but it's whether they want to have a happy dreamlike state for the rest of their life, or what we assume because it's never really gone into detail, or they turn into monsters and most likely defeated, which is what happens to an alarming number of people throughout the story. The game opens in a time called the Purge, and this is because a Grand Pulse fal'Cie is actually found on Cocoon, and because of that everyone gets scared that there may be fal'Cie running around causing damage or planning to do something, so the entire town and everyone in it is purged. And this opens the main plot of the game, where our main hero Lichen, and Saz, who you shortly meet afterwards, is fighting to regain her sister who's being taken away because he's one of those people who's been turned into a l'Cie. Also fighting in the resistance group is Snow, another central character to the game, and while trying to rescue other people they're also joined by both Vanille and Hope, who are exiles who are being shipped out as part of that. And when the 5 of them all end up travelling together, they come face to face with a fal'Cie and find themselves branded as l'Cie and given the focus themselves. However, they're given a vision of Ragnarok, which is an ancient creature that put an end to the war in the first place all those millennia ago, and with that, Lightning's sister Sarah actually turned into Crystal because her focus seemingly was to bring all of them together for this one task they've now been given. However, everything is short-lived, as from this point on everyone is pretty much on the run, and they also get split up too, with everyone going on the run except for Snow, who's trying frantically to rescue Sarah from her crystal, which just isn't possible. It leads him to be taken off and leads him to meet Fang, who's actually someone else who woke up from a crystal state, having completed the focus a long time ago. And throughout this portion of the game, everyone is split up into 2 different teams. We have Fang and Snow, who most of the events with happen actually off screen, whereas Lightning gets paired up with Hope and Vanille gets paired up with Saz as they all go up various businesses, with Saz very much on the run and not really wanting to be part of it, while Lightning has still very much got a vendetta, who's kind of training Hope as you go along too. This portion of the game is very much all to create development for our characters. It's where we learn everything about them before they're all brought back together and they're given their focus, or at least they're re-given their focus for the rest of the game and what they actually have to do. We learn about Lightning and how she was brought up and how she looks after her sister, and how Snow was actually her fiance and it wasn't something she was happy about. We learn about Saz and his son Daj, another young boy who's turned into a l'Cie unfortunately, who he feels really bad about, and Saz is one of the most shit on characters throughout the entire series of Final Fantasy XIII. We learn that Fang and Vanille are pretty much sisters and that they both completed the focus a long time ago, and later on, come to find out that that was summoning Ragnarok the first time, and hence why they've been re-brought back to life now in order to do that. And obviously Hope spends most of the game suffering from the trauma of seeing his mother die, who he blames Snow for, and so throughout this portion of the game as well, when he finally gets back up to Snow, he can't quite bring himself to kill him, although he has anger and hate, and it's all about how he deals with that and really how he whines about that as well. He is a kid and he doesn't know how to get all that out there, but it does make for an unlikable character, or at least a slightly badly written character in how he chooses to send all this information across to us. It's not great, but it just means that Hope has become one of the characters who needs the most work in future sequels of the games. Of course, when they do eventually, all through various circumstances, come back together as well, they meet the Sanctum Primarch, who controls Cocoon, Barthandelus, and he eventually explains that their focus is to transform into Ragnarok again and slay a fal'Cie called Orphan, who controls everything. He's the one who keeps Cocoon afloat above Pulse, and by doing that, essentially Cocoon will fall into Pulse and destroy pretty much everything. Of course, naturally, with the idea that they are the ones who are supposed to create the destruction and kill possibly millions of people, they run away from this again, as you probably would. They try to find ways to actually remove their branding, and it makes for a different kind of pace section of the game, because during the portion of Grand Pulse, everything is opened up, it's bigger, it's completely different to what it was before, which is kind of interesting from a gameplay perspective, because you've gone 20 hours or so without really ever leaving this hallway, and now suddenly everything is opened up and it's different, and there's places you can go and enemies you can't possibly kill because you're just not strong enough, and you're kind of hurdled that way instead, as opposed to a straight hallway. If you can't defeat something, you probably shouldn't be there, but on the side of that as well, there's also subquests and hunts and bits and pieces you can do that you've never had before, and it's all, well, it's the complete antithesis of the experience up until that point. It makes it seem like a completely different game, which is just extremely strange why they've gone to go this way. At the time, people talked about it being because of the ports of the 360 needing data to be put across 3 different discs, but apparently the design was always that way, and the story does support this, and that the story has our characters constantly on the run. They're fugitives, they can't stay in towns and talk to people. People are scared of them, they're running, and they'll let the military know the minute they see them. So it's all supported, but it's kind of strange. Of course, the party ultimately comes to the conclusion it's Barthandelus they need to defeat, and upon finally breaking back into Cocoon and doing this, they're unfortunately not quite in time. Orphan himself, the great god Fal'Cie, awakens and Barthandalus is able to merge with him, and seemingly makes all the party aside from Fang seem like they've turned into their monster states from failing their focus, and yet they're able to come back before Fang transforms herself into Ragnarok in order to take him down, and the party make one last stand, finally defeating this merged Barthandalus Cocoon Fal'Cie. Ultimately it means that Cocoon is dropping, but the final thing that both Fang and Vanilla are able to do is transform into a giant crystal state again from completing their focus and use that to hold Cocoon up. It's something of a down ending, but most Final Fantasies are to a degree, and it's not nearly the tragedy that I suppose Final Fantasy XV was. It ends on a more optimistic note in that everything has been stopped and the Fal'Cie are no more to a degree, or at least the main ones are no more, and yet everything can go on, and the world of Cocoon and Grand Pulse and the people of it, the people that are left, can grow together and work and make for a future that involves really them working together and choosing their own destiny, which given the circumstances is fairly hopeful, even though it'll be slightly retconned a bit with Final Fantasy XIII too. You can see how that spirit of working together does actually lead to some great things for the early millennia of the next, well, future decades and centuries of Final Fantasy XIII as the universe goes on. Obviously the story itself, well, disjointed slightly here as I've tried to present it and kind of critique it at the same time, and it's also very summed up for what is essentially a 40 to 50 hour long adventure. It's actually how the story is presented to the player that's the problem. As I said, the data log means that you have to constantly go and check back for facts to find out about things, or you're going to find yourselves at something of a standstill when it comes to understanding motivations of especially the sub-characters of the game. People like Sid Reigns and other small characters you only see a couple of times but are hinted to be important but never actually seemingly do anything. The theme of time that Final Fantasy has as a series as well, and 13 specifically, is kind of represented differently than it is in the other games. Obviously it's more on your nose through Final Fantasy 13-2 and Lightning Returns, but the theme of time here is more a case of they don't have time, they're very much on the run, everything has to be done quickly, and that kind of necessitates the fact that there's very little you can do in the game other than keep pushing forward, and yet the gameplay of the game actually seems to stagger you, so you can't always do that, and we'll talk about that and the levelling up system as well in great detail soon. But obviously you've got your main narrative, which is constantly knocked up by those 13 days as well, and it shows a slightly more hopeful time when the characters were happy, or at least it shows you them briefly happy before everything's stripped away from them. And it's a shame really, because despite the fact of the resume of how Cocoon is controlled, people are happy. They live in fear, but their day-to-day lives aren't bad, but yet during one circumstance and one event, everything that someone's lived for their entire life can be turned on their head as they find themselves shipped away and hidden just in case they might be a threat, and they're not given the benefit of the doubt. It's just cold out the way, and it's not great. It's like livestock with BSE or something that are just instantly, right, you could have this, you're gone. And transposed to humans and the society doing that is pretty hurtful, to say the least. Obviously outside of those flashbacks as well that are also in the novellas, episode 1 and 0, if you choose to actually go and read them, that give you some flavour text to everything that's going on, but they're very much supplemental, and they've only been fan translated as far as I know, or at least one of them has, and the other one I do believe got an English translation, but on memory now I'm not entirely sure it was, and it was actually a fan translation I originally read too when I did the first version of this video. Obviously as well, the game is chapter based, but it doesn't just stagger its story through chapters, it staggers your progression too, capping you at each individual bit, which is something that I take great problem with when it comes to progress, and it's something that can really hinder you too. I'm not a fan of it in any way whatsoever, and it can really destroy how you progress. It can be enough to turn some people off for certain chapters later in the game, mostly ones that are bookended by Barthandalus, can really cause great problems because there's so many ways to make your characters more powerful, but you're only really ever presented with going through the Crystarium, something that is almost a completely irrelevant thing, and you might as well just have standard levelling up. The Crystarium itself is also layer based, and that goes by chapter to chapter as you unlock more and more of it, but it means by chapter you can find your skills completely capped out, and with an excess of experience you can't use. You're supposed to supplement your Crystarium growth with your weapon growth, but very few people are going to know that, as well as the fact that your weapons themselves, anything you put into them, is very hard to get extra materials early on in the game. If you don't stick with one weapon, you try to grow up more of them, you're going to find yourself with a lot of problems and severely underpowered weapons that make some of the later bosses in the game a real problem. However, overall, you can say Final Fantasy XIII is a complete story, and it was designed as such. While there's a lot of stuff in the data log that will be capitalised on for the sequels, 13 was designed to be self-contained. It was supposed to be one singular adventure, and I don't think at the time they were planning a second game to go along with it, although it makes for something of a good investment to make use of that game engine and everything else to do that, and so 13.2 wasn't a big surprise. Game investments are quite important now in the amount of money they take, and so trying to make extra money up on your initial investment seems like a smart idea in the grand scheme of things. And after what they did with 10.2, I can't say I was completely unshocked by it. Even Final Fantasy XII got a sequel, even though it was on the DS, and that was part of a grander world already in Ivalice, which had other games that went into it. Ultimately, for that reason, there's no DLC or anything that goes into expanding the story of 13, which is a shame because there are characters that I think would have benefited from it. Sid Reigns, for one, would have been someone, but a DLC, even when it comes to Final Fantasy 13.2, was extremely polarising in how it was handled and not smartly done. Thankfully, it's something that later Final Fantasy games seem to have learned from, as Final Fantasy 13.2 would be the first instance of Final Fantasy DLC, and so I guess there were teething problems in how to implement it into a grand story such as this. But let's start getting into a discussion about the gameplay overall, because when it comes to the gameplay of Final Fantasy XIII, there's certainly a striking difference when you put it up against other Final Fantasies. If you want to talk about comparisons to the other Final Fantasy games, really you're talking about how it's nothing like them in many ways, and obviously Final Fantasy games to a degree are always different from one to the next, and over the years the stark contrasts between each numbered iteration in the series has grown more and more. Final Fantasy XII didn't really feel like much of a Final Fantasy game at the time, given that it was more like a one-player MMO, but then again that was also post Final Fantasy XI, which focused on that kind of gameplay exclusively anyway, so precedent was kind of set even if it wasn't an MMO multiplayer universe. And Final Fantasy XIII to a degree has similar issues, and its battle system really feels like absolutely nothing that's come before. They did say that they were striving for something that seemed more reminiscent of the battles in Advent Children, and it certainly does provide that kind of stuff visually. It is very exciting what goes on, but it's funny that it seems to be throwing a lot of visual stuff at you with very little actually going on under the hood, or so it would seem most of the time, and to the average player who actually participates in this battle system, you're going to certainly find out that it feels like a lot of stuff is being done for you, in the same way again like Final Fantasy XII with the Gambit system, but in that situation you're very much in control of everything because these ways of acting have been pre-programmed into your party, and with Final Fantasy XIII that's true to a degree but not entirely. But let's talk about the actual overworld to start off with, and traversal and how everything works. Now, Final Fantasy XIII has no overworld to speak of until you reach the world of Grand Pulse, a good 20 hours into the game. You're very much pushed through that one long corridor of progression, and that in itself is different to a degree. Now, all Final Fantasy games are linear to a degree anyway, it's just that they happen to give the appearance of being more open by travelling through things like the world map and such, where you can generally explore other places, but ultimately from plot beat to plot beat you have to take one specific route to get there. Only in very few circumstances can you get to one place through more than one way, and that's not to say that obviously there aren't other things you should be doing or could be doing to make your character stronger, but Final Fantasy XIII deliberately forgoes that by not giving you towns to explore, not giving you side quests and objectives to do should you choose to, and obviously you're also capped as well in how you progress your actual levels of power your characters have. It's all capped to make sure you have to go and progress through one way to the next, and it's not great, but obviously it does mean that after all that time, when you finally get to the world of Grand Pulse, you are hit by that massive injection of scale and grandeur that Grand Pulse has. Up until that point, Final Fantasy XIII has had nothing like it, and now all of a sudden you're in a big open world, and it's a complete gameplay shift, travelling from one place to the next, and suddenly it feels like you're exploring a big world, and everything feels like it's going slower because of how far you have to go to get from one place to the next. It's all about giving an illusion of grandeur, when ultimately nothing has changed when you first reach there. A lot of the stuff you can see but you can't actually do because it's a case of coming back in the endgame, and ultimately, again, it's just another illusion of it being Final Fantasy like in the traditional way we're used to. But ultimately, I think the gripe everyone has outside of that way of progression in 13 is going to be the battle system, and more specifically the auto battle system. Final Fantasy has no attack by default way of working. The Final Fantasy XIII battle system is all about your characters operating at all times. You're not playing one character or you're not directly controlling them. You can do for specific commands, and it still works in an active time battle way similar to older Final Fantasies, in that your characters will essentially have a ticking clock before they can take their next action, but that action can just be auto-queued, and the game will pick the most specific and direct attack depending on the enemy that they're going to target. It's really that simple most of the time, and the finesse comes in the paradigm system. And you see, you don't so much directly control your characters as you do their classes and what their kind of roles are in battle. Between something like attack, which does your more specific attacks, and your ravagers, and all these class names are somewhat confused in my head because between the English and the Japanese versions, where you have attack and magic and etc., in the English version you have commando and ravager and medic, and more specifically obscure and complex English names to make it sound better for a more worldly audience, and we're going to talk about this madness later. But it's all about switching the roles as you need them in battle, and yet the trick of the system that not many people seem to get is that you want to be switching constantly. Switching constantly means you'll get extra attacks in, and that's kind of one of the cruxes to beating some of the harder bosses. When you can chain in more attacks, you can get a load of attacks and a quick healing to make sure that you've lost no deficit by choosing to push the offensive most of the time, and that's what you have to do. You have to push the offensive. The whole idea of the 13 battle system is to stagger your enemy. When you stagger them, you can do intense damage, and they also can't fight back. You're essentially fighting back this whole time in a war of attrition to get them into stagger, and then you can really do the damage and really knock them down or chip them away depending on how powerful that enemy is. That's all it's about, making that stagger, and then you can really get in there and do the damage. And in most cases, once you're later on, a quick stagger is going to be all it needs to quickly take an enemy down, especially when you have higher level abilities yourselves that allows you to start maxing and breaking your damage limit when an enemy is in its stagger form. Now, in contrast to traditional Final Fantasies, because of how this works, there aren't things such as magic points or MP, for example, that really facilitate Final Fantasy. You can cast whatever you want. It's more a case of every turn you have a certain amount of allotted actions, and different spells and abilities will take different amounts of that, but you can queue up whatever you want. You can have magic followed by an attack or an area attack or a heal. You can mix and match as you see fit, or you can just let the auto battle system do everything for you, which is probably what you're going to do, because queuing up attacks and choosing everything manually is something that takes such an amount of time investment that you can't possibly do that and keep up a good chain of attacks constantly be reading off. You're essentially handicapped by not using that. You shouldn't most of the time, and while there are those big attacks occasionally you'll want to, like Army of One or other character specific superpower attacks that they can do, ultimately you're punished by choosing to do stuff manually, and you want to be in that auto battle system because that's what it's there for, and that's what the game wants you to use. It's what the developers wanted you to use. Now, outside of the standard battles and boss battles you get through the games, there are exceptions as well to everything. Obviously, Eidolon battles where you get your summons, 6 of them in the game, and they all have different specific rule sets and such where you have to use certain kinds of skills or abilities or team layouts in order to progress the battle. There's a slight puzzleness to them, and it's really the only battles in the game that attempt to try anything different, and they can be exceedingly hard until you've worked out what you've got to do, and generally the cusp of winning, given that you're on a time constraint as well, isn't great. Your characters are under a doom spell, which means they'll die after a certain amount of time, so you have to work out the system, you have to do it quickly, and obviously you have to keep doing until you actually get them, because there's nothing else you can really do to progress that early on in the game. Almost all the Eidolon battles happen extremely early on, or at least before Grand Pulse, and therefore you're very handicapped in how much you can do if you can't get past a specific battle, as is the case with bosses too. Of course, the ultimate crux for this as well is how that you'll die if your main character dies, the character you're choosing to be directly in control of inside the overworld. If they die, you go down, and that's not great. It's a really annoying way to do it, and when games do stuff like this, it's extremely frustrating, if only because a simple off attack can really spell the end for everything. And it's one of the great cruxes of the early Shin Megami Tensei games, where your main character can be knocked out and that's it, everyone's dead, and when enemies have instant death skills, it's really not great. Of course, in order to be effective in your battles, you're going to have to be leveling up and upgrading your abilities, and this is kind of done on two fronts. I'm going to start with the shops and upgrading, if only because the shops in Final Fantasy XIII are strange, narratively at the very least. You don't have shops in the traditional sense. You shop at save points and predetermined points where you can buy stuff, and I get that the game has to have shops and you have to be able to buy new stuff and abilities, but most of the time there's very little you're going to want to buy from shops. But also, where are these shops? Why are they serving you? You're fugitives on the run. Every person you see runs away from you in the game, always trying to actively kill you, and so shops themselves seem like something that's a bit strange. Even if it works on a credit system, you should be withheld access to these shops just by default and have to secure other ways of getting your items and such, like hunts or other general Final Fantasy or just RPG staples. But of course it's not just that. You can buy other weapons from shops too, but it's almost pointless to you because the limited resources you get during the game and limited money as well you get to buy upgrades means that you need to commit yourself to one weapon, and really you want to be doing that early on because you want to be upgrading early on too. You want to be upgrading your weapons because outside of leveling up that will be capped by each chapter, Leveling up your weapons is the only way to increase your damage output as well. There's no extra things you can equip to your characters that will make a grand bit of difference to the battles, and so you want to make sure your characters are hitting as hard as they can at all times. If you choose to swap resources between two different weapons, you're going to find yourself failing, and every weapon works in two different ways. They're either going to be strong in magic or they're going to be strong in attack power, and really you want the balance between the two, because you'll find most of the time that your characters themselves will constantly be switching roles too. You're very rarely going to have a character that all three of her slots in battle are taken up by being an attacker or a ravager. You really want them to be balanced, and so you want the weapons to be balanced too. So for that reason, you never really want to buy a weapon, and you just want to upgrade their starting weapons. All weapons work on a tree-like scale where they all lead up to being the same kind of ultimate weapon, so ultimately you might as well just go on that starting weapon, because it's not like there's a massive chain you can get by branching out in diversity. You're just moving towards the same step, and the earlier you get there the better. It's not some Dark Cloud or Dark Chronicle like weapons system where you can have thousands of permutations and such. There's very limited weapons, and you just don't want to buy any more, and you want to start with what you start with and work all your way through that. Ultimately, this does mean, of course, once you've been upgrading your weapons, the big weapons you find later on in the game, some of which can be slightly higher power, are essentially useless, because no matter what you equip once you've been upgrading a weapon will be useless, and the endgame grinding required to get more than one weapon up to a highest level point, the amount of grinding it takes to get one weapon up to the ultimate point, and the bosses and enemies you have to go through mean time-wise it's almost not worth it in itself as well. But do you want to do it with more than one weapon? Oh, if you want to do it with more than the three characters you're probably going to be using for the rest of the game, you're going to find yourself so handicapped by it, and it's just frustrating in many ways. And it's one of the things that 13 as a game just doesn't have going for it. The amount of time investment it wants before you actually start feeling like you're getting rewards from it. Of course, counter to this as well is your leveling system, the Crystarium, and the Crystarium is one of the most beautiful leveling systems I've ever seen, contrasted by the fact it's one of the most useless leveling systems I've ever seen. It is a linear, almost completely linear slog through level to level, and it has echoes of the Final Fantasy X sphere grid, but the problem with it overall is that you're just going from bit to bit. There is no choice, there are no branching paths you can take, and even Final Fantasy X rectified this. You can't put your characters into different roles, non-roles that they're not expected to do, because it's not until the end game that you have the ability to unlock extra stuff on the grid or extra classes. Every class has its own tier of Crystarium, and up until most of the game, the characters will only have 3 of the 6 to choose from, which means they're kind of hit into specific classes you're supposed to use them for, which in itself is fine. But the problem is that why not just have a leveling and EXP system after battle? Why bother with the Crystarium at all? Because going into that and doing that amounts to nothing more than wasting time. You could have this kind of data of what your stats have increased to pop up at the end of battle of each level up, and it would have no actual consequence to the gameplay itself. Your characters would be more powerful, and you've saved yourself 5 minutes from going through and watching that crystal slowly rise up the tree. There is absolutely no point to the Crystarium from what I can see in functionality. You might as well just make the whole system completely linear and let those abilities just trickle off like a standard leveling system, like, well, almost every other Final Fantasy game. Don't be new for the sake of being new. Don't try to innovate with something that is functionally worse than everything you've had beforehand. Making something pretty does not always excessively make it functional. Yes, you want to show off your big Crystal Tools engine, fantastic. Your Crystal Tools engine is certainly the godsend of lighting in video games, or it was at the time. Some of the stuff that the Final Fantasy XIII engine has come up with does look fantastic and spectacularly beautiful, especially when you have big weights and environment. Its colour range at that end of the spectrum is fantastic, and you see examples of that throughout the series. They have room specifically to show off the lighting tech of their engine in the game. But the Crystarium as a thing is something that just shouldn't really be there. It's not great at all, and obviously as well, per chapter it's looked off too. So before you can go to each next stage of the Crystarium on your way up, you're going to find that if you don't progress far enough, you're just locked up, and as I said, weapons are the only other way to make your characters more powerful, so you're really stuck either way with what you want to do. If you can't progress, you either work out the intricacies of the battle system, which not everyone's going to want to do, or you give up, which I've actually known a lot of people to do, and honestly, with good reason. Now, all of this has led to me saying there's very little diversity in the ability to experiment outside of it, and that's not true. There are side quests in Final Fantasy XIII, there's mini games too, but there's really not many. Actually, there's very little whatsoever at all, and most of that comes down with Grand Pulse, when you can suddenly get hunt missions and such, where you see Sea of Stones around the map and you can interact with them, and it'll tell you how difficult the task is and what you need to kill and where you need to go, etc. And that works more or less like an MMO, where you get a task, you go here, you kill something, you're done. Minigames wise, however, the game seriously has a loss for what to do with that, and it gives you the perfect place that you can go. You go to Serendipity with Saz and Vanilla. There are options and chances for mini games here that they could have found a way to expand upon throughout the game or reuse, but they don't. Nothing happens there. A big casino-like town, the only town you properly explore in the game where you're not being hunted, and yet they don't make good use of it. You have a brief stint with Chocobos, and Hope and Lightning have a section where you get to control one of the Dreadnought mechs, which is something that is actually fun and really should have been brought back for later parts of the game. They could have found ways to incorporate that onto Grand Pulse, and it would have been great fun just as a distraction, but there's absolutely nothing else. Now, it's something that in Final Fantasy XIII 2 they'll certainly recognise and take care of, but it seems like since Final Fantasy VII and the Gold Saucer, people have expected minigames as a whole, or the card battle system, or your Blitzball, a dominant minigame throughout the series, throughout your game, and, well, 13 just has nothing. It's a big letdown, really. There are other bits and pieces as well once you get to Grand Pulse. There are the Titan Trials, which is something interesting as well, but it's all based around more fighting. I want to see some diversity, I want to see some breaking up. It's been shown in development diaries and such that there were plans to have other things. Even Final Fantasy XIII 2 wanted to have Snow going on a motorcycle around, and it's bits like that that I think people would have enjoyed a bit more, especially something to just get around Grand Pulse in a faster way. Yes, you have your Chocobos, and that is very much a staple, but outside of that there's just not much else really, and it is a big letdown that it seems like the development budget and time of the developers was put in the wrong places, and to a degree that's true of Final Fantasy XIII in general as a whole, that the right ideas were there but their implementation was wrong or was pushed in a direction that really it didn't need to go in. Again, we'll talk about it. The changes, however, weren't just related to the translation of the battle system. There were simple things that were done in production, like Lightning's name being changed from Leclerc to Lightning. Obviously, having Leclerc sounded a bit like Eclair, and obviously the names are French-based in the first place, but they wanted to move away from that for the English language stuff, and so everything was changed. But on the flip side of that, the more crazy stuff that just doesn't make sense is a complete retranslation of the English soundtrack to English again, a second time. Seriously, songs like Sunlift Waterscape in Japanese have English soundtracks already. All the lyrics in them are English, and for the English native release, there were a complete new set of English lyrics released with it. And I can find absolutely no real reason why to do this. This seems like a complete waste of money and resources. If they're trying to make just more detailed language or a better use of English, to a degree you can be argued that some Japanese or English kind of lyrics, you only have to look at the Kingdom Hearts songs like Simple and Clean and the other ones that come with Kingdom Hearts to see that the translations don't always work great when they're put into English, and so in some circumstances you can certainly advocate for retranslating the track into something that flows better into native English and at least sounds like a coherent song. I didn't think Sunlift Waterscape in general had this problem. After all, the lyrics are generally based around simple Final Fantasy tropes and just generally summing up the area and being a nice cool tune that you can listen to in that area of the game. It's not something that really has a problem. It's not something that I personally feel like needed that, but then again it could be in some cases that other people do have that sort of problem, and unlike all the battle translations and everything around that, I can at least see the logic behind this, even if I don't completely understand its use this time. Of course, the one thing that the design really does well but isn't explained well in the game is the general world of Final Fantasy XIII. Now, I've mentioned the data log before and how it does contain absolutely everything you really need to know about the universe, as well as setting up ideas and characters if you read through it that you'll come to know in later sequels, like the goddess Etra and Bunavelze, and they're both characters that will be referenced slightly in 13 but become major factors in 13.2 and Lightning Returns. But it's in the world itself, how the l'Cie work and how the fal'Cie work and how they govern both Cocoon and Pulse, that really needed to be explained better in the game. The problem is Final Fantasy XIII lacks a proxy character, someone who really explains everything. The closest you get for the main story is Hope, and obviously all the adults have to speak down to him, which doesn't help in his portrayal as a character. But the big problem is that he also does know how the world works. Everyone knows how the world works. There's no need to really explain it to anyone, and so the facts of each fal'Cie and what they do are only briefly explained when you get to them. You get the big fal'Cie that are ultimately your big bags like Barthandless, but then you also get the more down to earth fal'Cie like Carbuncle that get a brief explanation that that's a fal'Cie only dedicated to creating food for the populace and nothing else. It's almost a completely irrelevant fal'Cie in story sense, but provides a necessary function to the world, and that kind of fal'Cie and being in general does not get enough explanation in the main game and narrative, which I think would be helpful to understanding the world of 13 as a whole. And it's the same thing as well, especially with the relationship of Grand Pulse and Cocoon and how the eventual war started up. You're obviously told about the war and what happened, but there's very little detail given on the context of that. It's one of those areas where I think the 13 Days flashback could have been helpful if they'd done perhaps some previous life flashback with Vanille and Fang to see that area of time as well. Time, of course, being a main element of the game and something that will be capitalised on time travel wise in the future games, and again another reason I don't understand why they didn't think to do that in at least future games, to kind of show a bit of that area and that lifestyle beforehand as well. But ultimately the time travel of the 13 series focuses on the future and not so much on the past. Of course, there is the fact that overall Final Fantasy XIII does feel more sci-fi than anything else. Its aesthetic is all sci-fi, it's grounded in that. There's no neo-industrial look of Final Fantasy VII to it. It does seem like a very forward-facing evolution of the Final Fantasy VIII style, if anything something that was futuristic and clean, and for the most part is, and then transposed to the more natural futurism of Cocoon when you get there later on in the game, that's actually closer to something that resembles modern day, where you've got a big industrial area but very few areas seem to be polluted or corrupted, and it looks like building and architecture was limited to specific places for specific purposes only. Like Atomos, he seems to do very little in the game other than go from place to place burrowing and making tunnels, even though he does have an expanded purpose in the lore, again not really explained. And what is, our main characters seem to fear some Fausti but not others, even though they're all essentially able to make Lichen could at a moment's notice put some sort of extra focus on them. It's never really addressed. But the idea of the game obviously still being a fantasy, it's fantasy by design, but it's rooted in sci-fi and it has very few of the actual traditional fantasy aspects as part of them. It makes it feel very un-Final Fantasy as a whole, which I think as long as you've played the game you probably understand what I'm talking about here, even if it's slightly harder to describe. I think it's mostly in the main staples of the Final Fantasy series that it becomes a problem. Obviously the basic stuff is there, chocobos are there, and there are a few little nods to some of the old Final Fantasy music cues and such that are in there, but there's very little that relates it as a whole, and even less so with the English translation being one of those problems. You've taken away your staples of attack and magic and summon, etc., and replaced them with names that don't appear as often in Final Fantasy games or haven't appeared at all, and it just makes it feel less and less Final Fantasy. And this does feel like, to an extent, by design for that Western audience as well. They want to get more people to play their Final Fantasy games by making them less and less like Final Fantasy games. You can see why this logic hasn't lasted too long at Square-Enix, and they've kind of backpedaled on everything they wanted to do with Final Fantasy XIII since it was released. But we should probably talk about other aspects of the game as well, and for one thing I think Final Fantasy does well, Final Fantasy XIII does well in particular, and most of the games of the series do anyway, is the soundtrack. I don't think there's very many people who are going to argue that the Final Fantasy XIII soundtrack, whether translated or retranslated, is bad. Most of the music cues are on point for the game, and some of the music in the game is extremely fantastic to listen to. The battle theme, for all you hear it throughout the game, and that's almost in every single battle outside the boss tracks, is fantastic, and it's a really great hook. And while it builds slowly, and that can be something of a bit of a drain, once you get into that main hook of that battle system music about 30 to 40 seconds in, it's really enjoyable. It's a shame that later in the game battles don't often last that long, which are really powerful, but it's just a great hook for a battle track, and it's one of those few that really stay in your memory. Of course, there was a slight controversy with the inclusion of Leona Lewis's song that was used for the English version only, and was actually replaced the original music at the very end of the game. I would have a problem with this in some situations, but I actually thought the song chosen was rather relevant to the themes of the game as a whole, and I don't mind it so much. In my original version of this case study, I kind of made the fact that for my actual case study myself, I used Bastille's The Streets as the kind of way to retroactively referencing the fact that Final Fantasy XIII was nothing but a hallway, and in this case I think the Leona Lewis choice of song worked in the same way, and so I don't have so much of a problem with it per se. Yes, it's a slight nod in a way to kind of just get extra people to take an interest in the game. It's a marketing ploy if anything, but I thought it was fairly well used in the game itself, and it wasn't really something that's put as the main focus, just as an ending hook to the ending, as the ending ends on a rather more positive note, obviously, until it's retconned by 13.2, and essentially if you didn't like it you could look at 13.2 as retconning Leona Lewis's songs out of the 13 universe as well. But ultimately most of the soundtrack is pretty good, whether they're retranslating the lyrics or even switching the times and places that they use these tracks throughout the game depending on the translation. A lot of stuff happens on the translation that, or rather the localization of the game, that I don't completely understand the logic behind, but there's little bits and pieces here and there that seem strange of a thing to be paying people to do, when ultimately no one's ever going to have asked for this stuff. And So I just advocate that the budget for whatever you paid to do that could have been put elsewhere to develop other features for the game, to do other bits and pieces that would be more relevant. So now let's take the true deep dive into Final Fantasy XIII with a look at the characters themselves, the main characters, the villains, and obviously how they're portrayed, specifically from Japanese to English, and etc. And let's jump in with, I suppose, the series' main character, even if the 13 game itself is more of an ensemble cast, Lichen. See, Lichen was originally someone who was pitched as being a female Cloud, which in actuality is more of a female Cloud of what Cloud became post Final Fantasy VII, more how he was portrayed in Advent Children, not so much how he was in the original Final Fantasy VII, when he had a bit of a sense of humour and a cocky attitude and didn't mind cross-dressing. Lichen is very much the antithesis of Cloud back then, but the Cloud of now, yes, a much more closer approximation. Lichen, obviously as a character, has a troubled past with the death of their mother. She kind of shed all emotion really to become almost a hollow shell of a person in a way that kind of always had to be there for Sarah, her little sister, and that's everything her character itself is based around in Final Fantasy XIII. She gets a bit of a camaraderie with Hope as they grow together throughout the game, travelling together, but for the start of the game she's mostly concerned with Sarah and very little else. She's paired with Saz for a while at the start of the game, and you get to see what she's initially like through him. Now Lichen will go on to become a much more liable character, and this whole lack of emotion thing is a plot point that's retconned in Lichen Returns, but without that being any sort of thing in itself in 13, it's simply a case of assuming that she's grown up to become not cold-hearted, but to show a lack of passion in a way of how she acts, because she's being emotionless so she can look after Sarah, but it's mainly something that just makes her quick to anger and very quick to judge, especially in Snow's case, who she really seems to despise. She doesn't like his philosophy, and it's not hard to see why, even if you don't agree with how antagonistic she can be towards him. Snow is also a very hard character to like, and is a complete swap when it comes to Lightning and how she is, and how Hope's view of a hero is and what he does, and you can see why the two would clash easily anyway without bringing a little sister who wants to marry the guy into the mix. Her portrayal kind of stands apart as well to how she's portrayed as a warrior, and that while you could say ultimately she doesn't always feel like she's a friend with these people she's travelling with, she does see herself as a valid companion of them in a fighting and a team sense, and certainly does develop a camaraderie to them towards the end of the game, and something that I think that bonding truly for her doesn't happen towards the very end when she realises she needs people as well. She's always the one who pushes everyone else forward, she's the one who defies fate really, and that is a trait that will go on to define her through other games as well. I'm going to talk about Hope next, because in my opinion he's kind of one of the biggest characters of the series next to Lightning as well, and obviously has a main part in this as well as being a main part of Lightning Returns and a smaller part of 13 too to an extent as well. He also has the next most amount of growth I think during the series, but Hope is a troubled character to say the least, one who the writing for does not help you like him. It's a shame really that he's perhaps got one of the more tragic backgrounds, perhaps the second most tragic of the series, and obviously you actually get to see that tragedy happen to him as well, and that shock, that life-changing shock of seeing your mother die and seeing the person who is responsible for it, someone who you initially could have looked up to but ultimately is the one you then blame for your mother's death, in this case Snow. That kind of defines him over the first 2/3 of the game as well, something that he eventually has to learn to get over, as well as how he learns that obviously Snow does feel responsible for what he's done, but there's also a case of it's war and that's the thing and it happens, and he doesn't like being responsible for putting people in harm's way, but he also has to fight, and this is something that Hope tends to embody as well, and through that Snow does become something of a role model to him as well, in a completely different way to how Lightning is through the game. I think a lot of the characters around Hope do kind of project onto Hope as well, which kind of leads him to constantly flip-flop in his development as well, but ultimately most of the situations he is in tend to lead him to be seen as a little bit more of a whiny character. I can understand why, and there's an element of post-traumatic stress as well to the events with his mother, but I think it could have been dealt with in a better way. The problem is that he's a young character, he's a child, and he's gone through all this, and ultimately it's going to be a very tough act to get that right, and while they're not successful, I'm at least thankful that they did try something like this. Of course, in contrast to both Lightning and Hope, Snow is a completely different kettle of fish as a character, and he probably receives the least development over all three games. In fact, he doesn't change, he has an unwavering optimism and hope and will to be the hero, and that does kind of make him insufferable in my opinion, but it also makes him extremely consistent and the one who, at the very end of everything, is the one you can pull back. They even pull a bit of a bait and switch with him, thinking he has finally come to becoming a corrupt character in Lightning Returns, and that's pulled back too. Snow has, well, he has the optimism of a true hero, to say the least, and he has a lot of character aspects to him that make him a hero. That he's physically built, he's got the looks, he's the strong leader, but he also doubts himself as well. Not much is actually given into this, though. It's not developed much, and there's very few scenes with Snow at the start of the game as well, so you're given an impression of him and then you're left without him for a long while. And when he comes back as well, he seems to be even more of a know-it-all than you seem, because you've not seen what he's learnt in that time for quite a while. His interactions with Hope do help him grow as a character a little bit, but that growth isn't so much growth because that stuff is there all along. He just doesn't bring it to the surface of his character. He is also to a degree one of the most passionate characters of the series as well, obviously, especially in his love for Sarah too. And in the 13 Days flashbacks, you get to see that despite all this, really his love for Sarah is very much true, and that's the one thing that drives him forward emotionally as well. He wants to help Sarah, but in a different way to Lightning, and ultimately it's that passion that makes him the first one to receive an Eidolon as well, in the form of Shiva. He's an interesting character, to say the least, and I think was put there to be the driving force behind all of them when no one else was able to be there. Having someone with unwavering optimism and faith in what they're doing and that they will find the right path is refreshing, also annoying to a degree as well. And I think once again a lot of people will know what I'm talking about by this, but it means that ultimately I really don't like Snow too much as a character through the games, although I really do like what they do with him later on in the game. But he always feels like an answer to a question a lot of the time that no one asked for, when other ways of using the character could have been made in, or he could have been toned back slightly as a character as well and still being just as effective overall. And this brings us nicely onto Sazh, who might be one of the most diverse, interesting and severely underused characters of the entire 13 franchise. He's also possibly the most shit-on character I have ever known in any Final Fantasy game. Throughout the trilogy, this guy goes through absolute hell, and he's rewarded by becoming a factor in the game series that's almost lesser and lesser per installment. I mean this by his importance to the overall plot becomes less and less, only turning up as he really needs to, and in Lightning Returns, barely showing up at all, only to once again have lost his son and be going through absolute hell as a father, with no actual real need to in his main backstory really. He's a guy who doesn't deserve any of this, and it makes for a more interesting character. Yes, most of the time he's going through more depressive waves because he's lost his son Daj in some form or another, and ultimately through 13 and Lightning Returns he gets the absolute worst of that, whereas in 13-2 he just doesn't really appear much outside of his own DLC. And the thing is with Sazh, aside from the more obvious that he's based on Lionel Richie and is actually one of the more well-rounded black characters that Square-Enix have actually ever done, making him purely a father and absolutely nothing else first, and that's quite a brilliant move I think on that part. Sazh seems like a character built up to go through hell. He's certainly able to cope with it for most of the game, but his guilt and sadness and everything that surrounds that is really what keeps pushing him on, or almost doesn't halfway through the plot as well, as he does nearly commit suicide onto the strain and pressure of everything. And again, it's another sad situation where it's kind of understandable, but I find him interesting outside of that as well, because he's one of the first actual father characters who gets main prominence as a playable character in the main party, or at least someone who's at the forefront of the plot the entire game. This isn't something that Final Fantasy games usually do, and it's something taking away from the mold that I actually do like, and one of the choices that I think defines Final Fantasy XIII. Outside of father figures like Laguna from Final Fantasy VIII, who you actually do get to control, but this is before him becoming a father, so it doesn't actually resonate in the same way. Sazh is able to relate to the plots and everything going around the other characters and how it affects them in different ways, which makes him interesting, and I do wonder if it's in a way to resonate with an older audience of Final Fantasy players. But outside of that, it's just an interesting perspective to have someone, I suppose in that way though, it's interesting to just have someone in the party who has a somewhat different story than we're used to. But then again, as a whole, most of the characters fulfill some sort of role in some way and all have a different kind of loss they have to deal with from a past of their family. Sazh has lost his son, Lightning's lost her sister, Snow's lost his fiancée, Fang and Vanille have lost each other and are pretty much sisters, but they've also lost their home, their family, and found themselves woken up in a completely different future, and obviously we'll talk about them in a second too. But Sazh still stands apart, and I think it's because his voice actor, as well as his overall portrayal, mannerisms and everything, help to make a well-rounded character who, while shit on that, only helps to endear him to me, unlike many of the other characters who their woes I don't quite resonate with as much. And I do wonder that it's something that, as becoming a father as well, the character has grown on me even more, and something that works on a meta layer of gameplay that means that the character's nuances aren't always something that everyone's going to understand, but are very much there, and it's something I'm thankful for. Of course, this now ends us on Hope and Vanille, our the final two characters rounding up the party, and They spend a lot of the game apart, as many of the characters do in that respect. They were the two people who originally summoned Ragnarok during the Great War, and now they've been resurrected from their crystal forms in order to do so again as part of a new focus. It leads an interesting dynamic to the group because obviously they're both Grand Pulse based as well, unlike almost every other character in the game is from Cocoon, and you get to see a little bit of their culture and everything through their clothing and how they act and their accents. You don't get much with the actual culture of Grand Pulse, and through these two characters you actually get to explore a little bit of it as well. They're interesting, and they're family in their own way through being sisters, and they're a kind of family unto themselves, and they become even more so as part of the main group as well throughout the plot. But they also have the guilt of what they've done that hangs over them, and they're not sure if either one has the strength to actually go and carry on forward with what they want to do. Fang herself, as well as summoning Ragnarok, has left her sea mark being blue in a frozen state, which seems to indicate that unlike the rest of them, she wouldn't actually end up losing her focus or failing because she seems to be frozen in that state. It's something that gets sorted out by the end of the game, but it's an interesting thing and brings up a different team dynamic when they realise that it is actually possible to freeze the sea mark as well, although the grounds for doing so are something that no party member is actually going to replicate. As much as they are together in one form, they also stand apart in both their personalities and differences. Vanille is very much the secret keeper of the group, and she likes to not tell things in order to help Fang, who's actually stronger overall, but Vanille protects her in a different way, while as Vanille is still the weaker character as well. Perhaps her faith and her inner strength is somewhat higher than Fang's is, but they do round each other out rather nicely, and it's a shame that we don't get to see too much of them together. The overall strength of their relationship is really shown in parts like when Vanille has to deal with her Eidolon coming, but there's not really enough to show these two together, and it's something that, again, I would have liked really fleshed out. It's an opportunity to show the past of Grand Pulse and Cocoon, and you have these two characters that you can show this through as a proxy, and the fact that they don't is just another, I think, missed opportunity of 13. And in contrast, obviously, to all of these characters, we have our villains as well, which is kind of interesting because most of the villains presented during the game, we find out later, are actually just in manipulated form by the fal'Cie. All the government and absolutely everything we know of the world of Cocoon is under the control of fal'Cie in one form or another. It makes everything a meta plot where everything goes from the big empire being the villains to the empire being just pawns in the great game just like everyone else is. It's kind of a shame because it means that we never really learn anything about the empire and at least the humans who run it, the ones who aren't directly controlled. And you see a few of them through characters like Sid Reigns and some of the other characters, but they ultimately get sacrificed for the main good of the plot as it really amps up towards the final third of the game. And after that point, there's really nothing left aside from the actual militia who is still sent after you when you're invading Cocoon. It's a big loss overall that they couldn't find some other way to incorporate this, and obviously the big empire is something that is present only in 13 because we have a completely new unified system of people and in the sequels going forward, and so what we have in 13 just stands as a reason to have a constant stream of enemies coming at you throughout the entire of 13. If there's no one to chase you, there's no one to hurry you through everything, and that's really the only thing that the Empire itself generally has to do. Whereas the fal'Cie aren't introduced as the major villains of everything, or at least one particular fal'Cie, Bartangulus, until the very end, or at least the final third of the game as well, which makes everything harder because you've had to slog through everything, only for now to be when the big reveal is, if you completely understand it, and again, I've talked about that already. Of course, the fal'Cie by design aren't all bad, and that's the thing that I don't think quite gets explanation enough, that not every fal'Cie is in on it, and not every fal'Cie is going to ultimately be standing aside Bartangulus. Most of them are happy just to complete their main focus in life, which is to do whatever they need to do, purify water, make food, light, whatever it is, but other fal'Cies are more in place to govern others, and their backstories and ultimate reasons for doing so as well, again, are in the data log if you want to go and look it up, and are expanded on further when it really comes to the actual gods of the universe, Bunabelze and Etro, which kick off from Final Fantasy XIII 2 onwards, but get the tiniest of mentions towards the end of 13. Ultimately though, it's interesting to note that the accents of the characters as well do come very, very diverse, especially in the English language too, where they've put a lot of thought into just not how culturally diverse as in one continent the accents are, but people of Grand Pulse are given Australian accents to seem very, very different from, despite speaking the same language as every other character, and it makes for an interesting way to actually show it. And I know that Australian accent for some characters has been a bit draining on some people. Not everyone likes it, but I do like the cultural diversity they try to show by essentially copying the British, Australian and American dynamic when it comes to accents and how it applies them within the topology and the geography of the game itself. It's an interesting thing to look at, and granted not much in the grand scheme of things, but I like the thought that went into the English localization for this area, because it actually stands above the Japanese localization for it, even though Japan has many more cultural accents per, I suppose, square mile than most other countries in the world. It's kind of clever how the localization team didn't just base it around many dialects of either England or America, but actually chose to make it more worldly in its approach, which is something that the Japanese Final Fantasy XIII I don't think quite captured as well. But then again, that might not have been the original intent and something the localization team chose to do on top of it, in which case I like the effort they went to. So ultimately, how do I feel about Final Fantasy XIII now I've gone through it yet another time? And the game is still draining to play. Ultimately, that early slog through the game does get boring, and no matter how many times you play the game, whether it's for the first time, the third time, or trying now the PC version for that new big 1080p 60 FPS look that I think makes everything slightly different and feels like it's going slightly faster, but you're still playing that same slog, and it gets to a point where you feel like you're really wasting time because you know you've done exactly these things before. It's not like you're getting a slightly different experience. I know exactly what I have to do. I have to grind a certain amount to max out my Crystarium so I can take on the next boss, as well as getting as many items as I can to make those weapons stronger. It's one of very few games where I can feel like the intro to the game I'm playing the exact same thing and doing the exact same steps over and over again with very little diversity. It's not like I'm discovering new side quests or mixing it up like I would be in other Final Fantasy games, or playing the game in a completely different order like I did with 15. This is a case where I've played the exact same game up until Grand Pulse over and over again, and I'm honestly thoroughly bored of it. On the flip side of that, of course, as well, though, we do have the Grand Pulse section that I feel like I'm getting more and more prepared for. I know the best routes to go, the orders to do all the monster hunts and the sea quests in, and when to start going up against those Adamantoises and spamming Vanille's death in order to get an early boost, but you still have to do that after the end of the game because you're not going to have the full Crystarium otherwise. Complex, and I'm still very much in two minds about it because I see the potential the game had, but then I also see what there is now and how certain decisions could have been made that have left in such a boring and mundane game in some places. I can ultimately see why so many people hate this and why it's so easy to come down on it like a ton of bricks, because it does make so many missteps that really ruin the game. But it's nice to see that Square-Enix have learned from this and what they did, because going into 13.2 everything changes. The ending was stripped out, it was retconned slightly, and something new was brought in which allowed them to take the series in completely new directions that allowed them to bring classical Final Fantasy gameplay elements, as well as themes, characters and ideas that make the series going forward a much more improved game. And if anything, I think the series as a whole, judged as a 3-game series, is something that Square-Enix should be thoroughly proud of and something certainly worth enjoying. Of course, viewed as that, it just makes Final Fantasy XIII an even longer introduction to the main series, and not even a good one adequately either. But ultimately, I think it stands apart as just being the worst of the three, but still ultimately not a bad game. Again, maybe just not a Final Fantasy game. Going on, it becomes more and more Final Fantasy, and that was by design of Square Enix. They didn't want it to feel like a Final Fantasy game to start off with, and then when they realised it should have been, the rest follow suit rather quickly. That's what we got for the 13 trilogy. Whether you watch the other videos or not, they are uploaded, but I'm not going to be redoing them because they actually got saved. I think the 13 games are good, and I hope you liked this relook into 13 if you saw the old review, or you enjoyed this little look now and decide you want to go into Final Fantasy XIII 2 and Lightning Returns. As always, thank you for watching these videos. They take a lot of time to do now. As I say, I try to do them more in depth, and unfortunately work life has got in the way this time. I've been made redundant, so I'm actively starting a new job soon, and I'll let you know about that as I do. But on the flip side of that as well, it's not a video without a giveaway. In this case, I have some new Final Fantasy XIII 2 art, or at least Final Fantasy 13-ish. It's no one's error. I'm doing a couples of Final Fantasy range for a future con, and so if you want this, leave a comment. That's all I'm basing this on, the comments in the video, but if you want to share and such along, I'm not going to do the giveaways until I get at least 5 comments in the video, because it's only fair, so that's leaving one of my videos still open. You can go and see what one for yourself. Ultimately, just thank you for watching, thank you for supporting. I know I'm not nearly the popular YouTuber I used to be, but hey, look at that, the people who enjoyed my stuff are the ones that came back, and thank you for that. And if you're new to the channel, thank you again for watching. I'll see you soon, and the next video I hopefully get out should be something slightly different and something new, but also slightly fun too. I'm also playing through God Hand for a future video, as well as watching Go Kaija, so a lot to come, and I'll see you next time. Bye guys.